Regression failures in Cypress driving you nuts? Stuck in a loop of failing pipelines and flaky tests? In this video, I'm going to show you how to crush those regression failures, stabilize your CI/CD pipeline, and even work with your devs to prevent those failures from creeping back in. Stick around and I'll help you with all those false positives and pesky reruns. And if you're just getting started, download my free guide, Top 5 Test Automation Best Practices. It's packed with actionable tips you can use today. Look for the link in the description. And by the way, there is one mistake that teams make when trying to fix flaky tests. We'll get to that by the end of the video. Let's start with the obvious. Why are your tests even failing in your CI/CD pipelines in the first place? If you're only fixing these failures locally on your laptop, then you might be missing the real problem. Tests that pass locally on your laptop but fail like in your CI/CD pipelines, it's a classic problem. It's not always the code. It could be the environment. It could be competition for common resources. It could be quite a few factors. I mean, your tests run on a nice beefy laptop. You know, you can just run them. Everything's cool. You get to see what's happening. You're running them during a time when everything's working optimally. But yeah, as soon as you check that stuff in, it starts failing. And usually it's just something in that pipeline that's causing all the issues, and you really need to debug those issues. Like you wrote and run your test on Windows, but in your CI/CD platform, it's executing things on Linux VMs or Docker containers. Or your tests could just be fighting with each other for resources. When you're running your tests one at a time on your laptop, maybe you're not seeing that. Maybe your tests are getting launched 10 times, like 10 people are launching your test at the same time. And they're all competing for like the same hardware or the same resource or using the same test account. And there's also slow test environments. There's just hiccups with the APIs getting you the data, unexpected code changes from a different team. Any number of issues could derail your tests. Understanding this is the first step in fixing it. I mean, you can't fix what you don't understand, so you need to look a little bit closer at the entire environment your tests are running in. But where do you even start to tackle these problems? Let's dive in. First thing I like to do is separate my stable tests from my flaky or failing tests. Not doing this can really cause issues with trust in your tests. The developers just see a bunch of failing tests all the time. They're not going to trust the results, and they're just going to stop looking at it. They're just going to keep seeing fails, and they're not going to notice when a new fail comes along. You're not going to notice it when a new failure comes along because you get blindness to seeing test failures daily. But you usually have some tests that pass all the time. You should want to separate those out and just start the stable ones that everyone can have faith that these tests are kind of golden standard tests for your suite. Set those aside and separate out for the ones that are always either failing and you don't know why, like the flaky test, or ones that are maybe new and aren't quite baked yet, the feature's still being developed, or ones that it's a known bug and you take it out of your stable test run and put it into this failed test run or known issue test run or flaky test run, whatever you want to label it. It's the one where you're getting the failing tests are there. And the ones that sometimes pass, sometimes fail, those go there as well. So how do you use Cypress to deal with this? Well, there's a couple things you could do. You could separate out into a different folder the tests that you want to run. I don't like this method, but it is an easy way to do it. You don't need any extra plugins or anything like that. You just kind of disable the test by going like it.skip. In the Mocha, it.skip will skip your test, or you can even take the describe block and then you describe.skip. That will skip all the tests in that describe block. Or you could also copy paste it or copy paste it out and get another file with your failed test and another one with the flaky tests or failing tests. Then in your CI/CD pipeline, you just have 2 test runs. One that is stable and solid, that will catch issues. If those fail, there's a real issue. And then a second one that runs afterwards. So you're always running those tests and then gradually promoting them to passing. But the devs don't need to see the failing ones all the time. That could just be a you thing. or you have those running separately in some way that they're not causing heart attacks with the devs. So the main thing is to get confidence in your tests. Your entire team needs to be confident. I think a better way to do this is to use tags. Cypress doesn't come built with tags, unfortunately, so there are a lot of test frameworks that have tags already baked in, like Nightwatch.js. I think there's quite a few others that I've used. Honestly, I can't even remember at this point, but I've used tags quite a bit. But unfortunately, Cypress does not come built in with tags, so what do? Well, we have to get a plugin, and yeah, there's quite a few tags plugins. I forgot which one my company uses, but I just looked up one. It's called Cypress grep. That looks really cool, and I'll just go over the document in a second and just show you what Cypress grep looks like. And then, yeah, you can, instead of like copy pasting and doing different folders and whatnot, each test you have, you can just put a tag, and then you have one test run that runs like the you just tag things as stable, or you just tag things as flaky or fail or known issue. Just create tags and exclude the ones that are failing from the ones that are passing, and just have two different test runs. So those are basically your two options. You have tags or some way to filter, or you have different folders and test files. I prefer the ones with tags because they're a little bit easier to handle. But the biggest point here is once you have this system in place, you also need a system for handling and following up on your flaky failing tests. You don't want to just leave them like that forever. So once they're in that category, you got to revisit it. If they've been stable for some set period of time, like I use, like if they're passing for 1 week straight, then I'll promote them to the stable category. The point is to have a plan to revisit these tests, track them, do something with it, and fix them and get them stable. So this is basically how you can corral your tests by separating them out. You know, you give your management, you give your other team members, you give the devs like that nice, clear, stable view, and that just builds trust. And then the flaky ones, it gives you something to tackle, but separates them out from the critical path. You don't want to be blocking people with tests that are wonky and don't provide value. So okay, here is an example of one of the tagging methods for Cypress. It's called Cypress grep. And yeah, you can just filter by doing something like this. And it actually just greps the test names. So you can just do test names instead of tags if you wanted to, but I suggest tags. Very simple, we can do an npm install. Then you have to update the support file, get some stuff in your config. And yeah, if you just follow these steps, you can get everything set up. And then once you're done, just show you how it looks in the tests. Here's how you can add tags right here. So it's just the test name, and then you put in the options section all the tags that you want, and you put an array of tags for that. Then of course down here you reference it with the @ symbol, and this is a way you can just reference all the different types of tags. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of instructions here. I won't dig deep into this because I'm sure you can read on your own, but this is one method of tagging tests in Cypress. Just separating these out alone could do wonders for the faith in your system. But is there something you can do in your test code in Cypress to make things more stable? Well, let's find out. Okay, let's talk briefly about writing test code that won't get flaky. You need some stable patterns to use in your test code. Some common issues that come out with flaky tests come down to the following. Poor CSS selectors. So if anything changes in the UI, if you have a bad selector, then boom, your test is going to blow up. On top of CSS selectors, you can also use dot contains, which will look for text on the page. So if you have a button that's labeled distinctly, then it just looks for that button and doesn't use the CSS selectors. And that's kind of natural to how a human would look for things. So I think that's a suggested practice for testing, is to try to look for things in a way that your user would look for things instead of doing these big CSS selectors. I have arguments with that because I am more about stable tests than trying to do things in a way that is the suggested, oh, this is how the user would do it. But I mean, if you have 50 buttons on a page and they all have different types, you're not going to be able to just use like dot contains, because you're going to get back 50 results for all the elements on the page. So I'm kind of going off the rails here, but if you have a unique text item on the page to click or interact with, use .contains instead of using the CSS selector. But if you have to use the CSS selectors, try to make them as minimal as possible. Don't go like div, this, that, this, whatnot, and then all the way down to your button. Because if those top level divs change, then you're going to break your test. So as much as possible, if you can just isolate that element in a very unique way, like if it has a unique attribute, like an ARIA label, use the ARIA label or the ARIA role. That'll be very distinctive. Or just use, if there's only one button on the page, just use the HTML button, like sci.get button. If that's the one thing on the page that has that, use that. The point is to be as distinct as possible to get down to that element. Finally, the thing you can do to really stabilize tests, but I hear it's not the current recommended way, but I say screw them. I think test stability is way more important than trying to appease some philosophy of testing. So my tip here is get the developer or you yourself get in and add something called a data test ID. So data-test ID, you can add this attribute in. It's not a HTML standard, but anything with data dash and whatever you want after an attribute, data dash is part of the standard. Test ID is something you can put to customize in, but a lot of test frameworks support test ID, data-test ID. So that's kind of a common practice, and test frameworks support it. The reason I say put in that data test ID for an element, you just pinpoint that element with your data test ID. It's important to your test and you need to get it. Just put in that data test ID and quit screwing around with CSS selectors that are going to keep changing from test to test to test. If you have a test that's always changing because of some UI changes, talk to the devs, get a unique data test ID in there for the element that you're testing. All right, I gotta be a little bit more on top of this, or I could be talking about it for an hour. So let me kind of run through things a little bit quicker. Something to avoid in your code is just doing wait, like sci.wait. Don't use that. Use it for debugging, but as much as possible, try not to use sci.wait. Instead, wait for a certain element to become visible on the screen. So you can do sci.get and wait for that element. Instead of waiting, you can put a timeout on that element. So you can do sci.get, after you put the selector, you can put colon, you're gonna put like a timeout there. So I think by default, it's about 5 seconds to wait for something, but you can do sci.get and put it up to like 20, 30 seconds and just override that default if it takes a longer time for that element to arrive on the screen. So that timeout thing can definitely help you out. You can also use sci.intercept. Sci.intercept will wait for certain API calls to finish. So sci.intercept, I covered this in a different video right here. I cover sci.intercept for mocking APIs, but you can also use sci.intercept just to see that the API fired. So if your page is loading, waiting for a certain API element, or you hit a button and you're waiting for an API to complete, you can use sci.intercept, put an alias on it, and just wait for that alias. Go sci.wait at whatever your alias is. That's a more stable way to wait for tests than doing like sci.wait 2 seconds or sci.wait whatever. Because now you're waiting on a very specific event or page element. That's much more stable for your test to wait on specific events, specific page elements to be either visible or present in the document object model. Because sci.wait, I mean, what if one day you're doing sci.wait for like 2 seconds, and then one day, oh, it takes 3 seconds. Your sci.wait is wrong. Why? You know, why is 3 seconds? You just keep bumping it up, and then every time your test runs, what if it is always coming back in like 100 milliseconds, and you're constantly waiting like 2 or 3 seconds and causing all your tests to like just run slower and slower and slower. Instead, just wait for that thing. As soon as it happens, click. Every now and then it might take 5 seconds, but what if 90% of the time it's just 100 milliseconds? Your test can kind of account for that. Much more stable test than just doing waiting for however many seconds. And then kind of the hammer, kind of going against my speeding up tests, but the kind of the hammer right here is sometimes you get a test that it passes once or fails once, passes the next time. Sometimes you just need to rerun it. There's a retry capability in Cypress. So you can add retries at either describe block, so all the tests on there, if anything test in there fails, all of them are rerun. And then you can actually put it on a specific test, the it. And there's a little retries thing as well. And I'll just cover that in this upcoming screen share. And yeah, the retries will retry as much as you want. So you can put like, oh, retry twice or retry 3 times. I would say only keep it down to once or twice. Any more than that, then something's obviously really wrong, but it really depends on your environment. If you're testing against a notoriously unstable environment at your company, retries are probably going to be your go-to. So really, those are the big hitters. And finally, on this point, it's not really your test code, it's your test resources. Make sure if you're using like a test account, if multiple people are running your test at exactly the same time, which can happen. A developer could be running it, another tester could be running it, your CI system could be running it, and y'all could end up accidentally running your test at exactly the same time. Would accessing this same account on like 3 different machines at once do something bad? Like say you're changing the way things, like you add a filter on a page and that becomes global for that user. And then another test isn't expecting any filters there on the data that's being presented. That test is going to fail. Or that test suddenly resets it back so it doesn't have the filter, and then your test will start failing. You see, you get a ping pong situation. And the solution could be, for this scenario, you create different test accounts for each test. I think that is a very reasonable step, and usually when I always advocate for that, and that's usually when whatever new company I work for, I'm usually the very first one saying, I need a dynamic way to create and delete test accounts. So that's my main requirement for software testing when it comes to a shared resource like that. If it's not a test account, like where I'm working Meraki, Cisco, like all our tests use the same test account because that's not really the important thing. It's usually the switches and the hardware underneath. So we're not really testing the test account, we're testing the hardware underneath, and that's usually the bottleneck. So whatever resource that is, make sure you have, your test is always getting a unique resource that's just dedicated to that particular test. So if it's a piece of hardware, you don't want multiple tests hitting and making changes on that hardware. If it's a read-only test, which means it's accessing it, but it's not changing anything, you can have multiple tests touching that resource. But if that resource needs to change in some way for that test, you don't want to be sharing that with multiple tests that can be running at the exact same time. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense, leave a note in the comment. You just don't, make sure your resources are isolated. So yeah, just stabilizing your code using these methods can help out a lot. So you just get rid of some unknown factors that could be interfering with your tests. So this is a test code issue that you can use to stabilize things. But even the cleanest code won't do a thing if you're not working with your devs. And if you don't have their trust, and if you don't have a good working relationship, then your tests aren't going to be a concern for them. So let's discuss that a little bit in the next part of the video. Okay, here's a big one, just working with your developers to create a more stable test environment. So a lot of times what happens, the developer's off writing their test somewhere, and then who knows, months, weeks, years later, you get the code and you're trying to test this code in your own little silo. You're not really communicating back and forth with your developers. And this is a serious problem. It might be something that you did specifically or the developer was trying to do intentionally. It could just be the process of your company. So this isn't something you can fix overnight. It's something you have to address over time. But things that you can do is make sure you're part of your daily stand-ups or daily meetings, whatever meetings are happening with your developers, make sure you're a part of it. During these meetings, you can always bring up the test issues that you're experiencing and, talk to the devs and see if there's anything you can do about these test issues. For instance, they can probably add like APIs to help you out. Like if you need your test to set up some stuff first and you going through all the UI to set these things up is too much work and causes tests to be really slow, they might be able to give you a few APIs that can just go brrr, and then set up your tests really stably and execute just the scenario you're concerned about in your end-to-end tests. You can also make sure you're part of the planning of a feature, because just hearing how the feature is going to be tested, or sorry, developed and how it's going to work, you can be thinking, how am I going to test this? And that could be, you could be like, hey, I need something to help me test this. I need to be able to access the database. I need to have something that tells me that the processing on the back end is done in some way, shape, or form. Either it's something in the UI that pops up, or there's an API you can call and say, hey, it returns a 200 code and says you're complete, you're ready to go to the next step. Also, you might not even need to be testing something. One of those flaky tests you have, developers, management, they might not care at all. You can just ditch the test. You wouldn't know that unless you had that conversation. And another thing that can be helpful is if the developers can add feature flags, so you can turn certain things on and off. So if they have something that's unstable that's blocking your tests, you can talk about adding feature flags so they can just turn off that feature until it's stable. And then your tests will pass instead of the other way around. Your test failing while this feature, yeah. So, like if your company's using things like launch darkly or whatnot to do feature flags, this could be extremely helpful. But the main thing is just having that conversation with developers, letting them know your problems, to you being aware of what they're developing. So you're part of all the sprint activities, all the daily stand-ups and all that, and you know what code is coming down for you to test. So that way it's not a surprise. You might need to know that you need to update your tests or they're all going to fail tomorrow once this Dev Joe checks in his Joe Schmo code and just destroys all your months of work. Yeah, but so the main point is that this is a people business. I know you're writing a lot of code and we have all this AI and all this crazy crap going on and we all have these super technical things and crazy frameworks and tools. But no matter what you do, it comes down to people and process. You have to be able to talk to everyone on your team. You have to have some type of working relationship to create stable tests. You have to be able to talk to each other, understand where each other is coming from, what problems each other is facing. They could be having a big problem with your test and you might not even know it if you're not having those conversations. So go to all the meetings. As much I hate meetings, I try to get out of them whenever I can. So me telling you to go to all the meetings is a little bit hypocritical, but go to the meetings that add value, that you're talking to your developers. Have a good working relationship with your developers. It goes a long way to creating stable tests. And finally, it's just the environment and pipelines themselves that could be the issue with your tests. Because it doesn't matter how great a relationship you have with your devs or how awesome your code is, if environment itself is crap. It's garbage. I've had to deal with that just recently at my own company, is where we have this one environment where all the developers I think this is common, so I'll talk about it really quick. We have this environment we call it Devel, but it's a developer environment. And what happens with this environment, developers develop their stuff and it's released into this environment and they just keep releasing. Every time they hit a commit, or they can just push a button and just release it. So every developer is in there releasing their code. Not only that, they're getting into the back end and they're starting and stopping services. They're rebooting things, whatnot. And it's a developer environment, so it doesn't have the same resources as the production environment. It doesn't have backups. It doesn't have like scalability. It doesn't have, it doesn't start provisioning new servers once the resources get high. So it's always in an unknown state. And if you have an environment that's in an unknown state, it's not testable. So our tests were always failing. We tried to use this as like a pre-production environment. It sucked. It was always failing. So here's kind of the, ideally, the type of environment. You should be able to fire up an environment unique for each developer's branch. So a developer branches off the main branch. You should be able to create a unique environment right there, and you test that environment that's only for that one developer's commit, and it's deployed into a stable running environment. Whether that's a VM, if you can do that, if your product allows you to do that, or whatever target platform your test is. It needs to be stable, and it should ideally run with just that one developer's commit. The reason being, this one developer can get that one commit in, you can run all your tests against that one environment. If they introduced a regression, you can catch it right then before their stuff gets to production, before it gets to any of these other environments, and they can very quickly tell, like, oh, my test or my new code sucks, it's causing regression, let me fix it before checking in. That's the ideal situation. Every place I've walked into doesn't have that situation set up. So the second thing is you have to find a different environment. You have to have some agreement that either you have something called like a staging environment that is stable like a production environment, and you get all your stuff in there and you test it, and depends on what process you have. I would suggest that, hey, you queue up a certain number of commits, put it into this staging environment, run against that certain number of commits, and then if they all pass, then you promote those commits to production. Well, that's a good way of doing it. You have a very stable staging environment. That's kind of hard to put together though, but it is a solution. Finally, you use feature flags, like I was talking about earlier, to release all your stuff to production, and then you test against production. I'd say that's probably one of the least ideals, but if it's behind a feature flag, it's okay. It's not released to the customer yet. You can run your tests against it, and then, we can fix it without any customer getting anything bad whatsoever. That's always assuming that the feature is behind a feature flag. Most likely, if it's a previous feature that got broken that's already public and your new thing just broke that, the feature flag might not help you. So releasing directly and testing in production is dangerous. I think it's the most dangerous of these options. The preferred way, make sure your end-to-end test run first against the stable environment. Anyway, kind of getting into the weeds here, but the bottom line is you have to work with your developers to make sure that you're generating a very stable environment to test against. That's it, stable environment. Also, whatever runner you have, you usually have a VM that is generated and then runs your test in your CI/CD pipelines. I've seen quite a bit where these VMs don't have all the resources to run things correctly. Like if it's Linux, you need to install like certain number of Linux dev tools. You need to install certain UI, GUI elements, or you just need to install all this stuff to make sure that the Linux environment is set up correctly before running your tests. I haven't had that much problem with that recently, but still it's something to be aware of. Especially with Docker containers, usually you have to do some type of setup unless you have a pre-made Docker container that already does all the good stuff for you. Cypress does have some Docker containers, but not a huge fan of the Cypress container because it's usually behind a little bit from the latest releases of the browser. So you kind of, but anyways, yeah, you make sure your environment, your VM itself is stable. And I think the biggest thing there is make sure you have enough memory and enough processing power. Because if you're running pretty extensive UI tests with a ton of tools going on at the same time, you're running maybe a mock server or whatever you're doing, it could take up a lot of resources and cause that VM to crash. So make sure your VMs are beefy enough to handle your tests. Because that can cause weird issues that you just kind of hit the top of that out of memory thing and that one little thing kind of fails and then it's just a weird thing and it doesn't happen all the time. That could be a total source of your flakiness. And like I mentioned, there was Docker containers. That's very important to have. No matter where you run the tests, it has the same environment. So a Docker container guarantees you have the same environment when you run your tests. So even though you run and develop on your laptop, unless you run it inside that one Dockerized environment or that VM that you have set up, that's always the same every time. That's where you get those differences. Like it works on my machine, but it doesn't work in this VM. You got to make sure you know how to use that Docker or VM or whatever environment you're using and make sure it's the same every time. And everyone's using that to develop and run the tests on. Otherwise, you're going to get those weird differences. And so however your CI/CD pipeline is executing tests, that's how you want to rerun the test on your machine. Or if you're rerunning on your machine and you realize I can't reproduce this, try that. Try loading up the Docker image that you're using on that VM and seeing if you get the same results. And finally, it could just be the environment itself is not that it's whatever test environment that they generated for you You know, if it's not production, it could be running low on resources. So you might need to work with the devs or your DevOps team to see what's happening on the back end of your application. It could just be run every now and then, like it could just be running out of memory, running out of disk space on the back end, whatever like servers you have running to give you the APIs or run the databases or whatever resources you need could just be crapping out. And finally, yeah, it could just be check for power outages. Maybe something's happening every night. There's power outages. It could be just something happening at a specific time per day. Like a good example, I forgot what book it was. I forgot where I read this, but every night this team was having a problem where the things would fail overnight. They could not figure out why, what was happening in the middle of the night. And they were going out of, they were trying to set up all these scenarios, testing all these things, checking every single wire and system on this device they had, and trying to figure out why was this thing failing every night. You know what it was? Every night the janitor was coming in and they were vacuuming and bumping the table the device was on. Every time they bumped the table, it caused the test to crash. So yeah, what's happening when your system's running? So if you're running against a particular resource, is somebody bumping on it, literally or figuratively? Is someone bumping your stuff and causing it to just fail here and there? That's just something to keep in mind when you're seeing this flakiness that's weird and doesn't happen in a known weird way. So check that back end. If there's any resources like Grafana or like you have Datadog, or if your DevOps, just see how your DevOps team is analyzing all the resources on the back end. Get access to that and, you know, get familiar with that. Like team up with a dev and, you know, figure out how to read that stuff. I'm still kind of struggling with that. Like I see all these graphs and whatnot. I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I usually work with the devs. I'm like, can you tell me what this means? I'm just a tester over here. I can't read this. Yeah, that could also be the issue, and you need to work with the devs to like bump up the resources in the back end in order for your test to pass. So that's it. Yeah, you just optimize your pipeline. You got to keep an eye on that and keep the quality of this pipeline in mind, that it could be the one thing that's causing the problems. Okay, so at the very beginning, I mentioned there was a mistake that a lot of teams make when it comes to fixing these flaky tests. The mistake I see is just turning the tests off. Ooh, you crazy developers, you weirdo developers, don't turn them off. Try separating them out into try anything else other than turning off your tests. Because if you get to the point where people just want to turn your test off, that means you've lost all trust with your tests. That's bad. So go back, rewatch this video, figure out some processes, talk with your team members, see about implementing these processes to get things back on track. Because if you're turning the test off, that means your customers are now the testers. That's not something that you want, unless you're Facebook. Sorry, Facebook, I just don't hurt me. I know you can, Meta AI thing. Don't hurt me. But yeah, the thing is to have a process in place, follow the process, and then make sure you're fixing these failed tests or fixing what's causing the failed tests. And that just requires just being aware of the stability of your tests, stability of the environments, and just creating good relationships with your other team members. So there you have it. How to crush regression failures with Cypress. It's all about understanding your environment, writing stable test code, and having good communication. How about you? What's your biggest pain point with your CI/CD pipelines, flaky tests, failing tests? Let me know. Drop some info in the comments. Share some of your horror stories. We'd love to hear it. Is there something that you've tried that also works? Everyone is always looking for ways. This is a common problem in a lot of companies. I'd like to hear from you. Let me know. Drop a line in the comments. I'd love to hear back from you. And I'm definitely replying to all the comments, so please let me know. And I actually do go into some of this stuff in my free guide, Top 5 Test Automation Best Practices. You can get this free guide by just scrolling down here in the description, hitting that little more button to expand it, and you'll see a little spot right there that says, hey, download this free guide. Yeah, it's actionable stuff. I tried to make it a very easy to use, something you can start putting into play today at your job. Give it a quick read. And now that you know how to crush these regression failures in your CI/CD pipelines, you might be wondering, how can you use Cypress to mock some data to help stabilize other types of tests? How would you do that? You're in luck. I got a video right here. And if you watch this video, pairing it with what you learned in this one, it's so much more powerful. So check it out. Happy testing. Take care.